In 2023, the Boston Bruins had the greatest regular season in NHL history. 65 wins, 135 points. 2 years later, they're near the bottom of the standings. Their captain is gone, and the dynasty dead. This is the rise and brutal collapse of the modern Boston Bruins. Let's rewind to 2022-23, when the Bruins weren't just good, they were unstoppable. Boston finished with 65 wins and 135 points, breaking NHL records that had stood for decades. They passed the 1995-96 Red Wings, the 77 Canadiens, and they did it with ease. Their first 23 home games, 23-0, a league record. They barely blinked all year. And this wasn't just a one-man show. David Pastrnak dropped 61 goals, second only to McDavid. 12 different Bruins finished with 30-plus points. The depth, ridiculous. On the back end, Charlie McAvoy, Hampus Lindholm, and Brandon Carlo anchored one of the league's stingiest blue lines. They allowed just 2.12 goals per game, one of the fewest in the NHL. But it was their goaltending that made the whole thing unfair. Linus Ullmark and Jeremy Swayman were a brick wall duo. Ullmark led the league in both save percentage .938 and goals against average .189. He won the Vezina Trophy, the Jennings with Swayman, and even scored a goal. From top to bottom, this team wasn't just built to win. They were built to dominate. No cold streaks, no panic, no holes, just pure, efficient, relentless hockey. Every stat, every shift, every result said the same thing. This was the Cup favorite. But in the playoffs, none of that mattered. The 2023 playoffs were supposed to be a formality. The Bruins weren't just favored, they were expected to steamroll. Instead, it all came crashing down. Matched up against the Florida Panthers, the last wildcard team, Boston jumped out to a 3-1 series lead. One win away from advancing. The building was buzzing. Pastrnak was scoring. Ullmark was locked in. And then, everything unraveled. Florida won Game 5 in OT, then Game 6. And in Game 7, with just 59 seconds left, the Bruins blew a lead. The Panthers tied it. Then, in overtime, Florida ended the greatest regular season in NHL history. Just like that. It was one of the biggest collapses in league history. Not just because they lost, it was how they lost. Undisciplined, panic, flat-footed. The team that dominated for 7 straight months disappeared in a week. And that loss didn't just end a season, it ended an era. Patrice Bergeron retired. David Krejci followed shortly after. 2 pillars of the franchise gone. Leaders, icons, the heartbeat of Boston hockey. Fans were stunned. The front office scrambled, and a team that once felt invincible was suddenly broken. The fall had begun. After the collapse, the Bruins didn't just lose a series, they lost control. With Bergeron and Krejci retiring, Boston's leadership and center depth evaporated overnight. And with barely any cap space, they had to make painful decisions. First, they traded Taylor Hall and Nick Foligno to Chicago in a salary dump. Then they watched key pieces, Tyler Bertuzzi, Dmitry Orlov, Garnett Hathaway, and Connor Clifton walk away in free agency. That's half your middle six gone in one off-season. In their place, the Bruins went bargain bin shopping. They bought back Milan Lucic, hoping for grit and nostalgia, not scoring. They signed James Van Riemsdyk, long past his prime, and they added Morgan Geekie to bolster the bottom six. These weren't replacements, they were patches, and everyone knew it. The forward depth that once looked unbeatable was suddenly full of question marks. Could Pavel Zacha become a top-line center? Could Charlie Coyle carry the load? Could they win without the guys who defined their culture for over a decade? The front office called it a retool, not a rebuild, but fans weren't so sure. 1 year removed from the greatest regular season in NHL history, the Bruins were already on edge, and the cracks were starting to show. Despite the mass exodus, despite losing their captain, the Bruins didn't fold. In fact, they surprised everyone. Boston finished the 2023-24 season 47-20-15, good for second in the Atlantic Division. They weren't as dominant, but they were still dangerous. David Pastrnak was electric, again. 47 goals, 110 points, leading the offense like he never missed a beat. Brad Marchand, now wearing the C, leaned into his leadership role with grit and pride. And the blue line, led by Charlie McAvoy and Hampus Lindholm, remained one of the league's best. Smart, structured, physical, they still knew how to defend. Then there was Jeremy Swayman. With more responsibility in net, he delivered. 2.53 GAA, strong starts, big saves. Even with Linus Ullmark still in the mix, Swayman looked like the future. And in the playoffs, they went the distance against the Maple Leafs in round 1. Game 7, overtime, Pastrnak buried the winner. Classic Boston heartbreak for Toronto. The city erupted. The Bruins were back for a moment. But then came round 2, Florida again. And just like before, the Panthers ended Boston's run. Not in 7 this time, in 6. The Bruins weren't collapsing yet, but the illusion of stability was fading. GM Don Sweeney said afterward, "It's still about chasing Stanley Cups. But chasing isn't the same as catching, and the cracks, they were about to become canyons." The Bruins entered 2024-25 with questions, but also hope. Sure, they lost Bergeron, Krejci, Hall, and others, but they still had Pastrnak, Marchand, McAvoy, and a breakout Swayman in net. They made moves, signed Elias Lindholm to anchor the top line. Big name, but his production had dipped. Added Nikita Zadorov, a 6'6" bruiser on the blue line for grit. It wasn't flashy, but the front office called it enough. It wasn't. Boston stumbled out of the gate, 8-9-3 to start the season. Sloppy defense, cold shooting, ugly third periods. And just 20 games in, they did something nobody saw coming. They fired head coach Jim Montgomery. Yes, the same guy who just 2 seasons earlier led them to the greatest regular season in NHL history, gone. Joe Sacco stepped in as interim head coach, but nothing changed. The spark never came. The wins didn't follow. Meanwhile, the roster started slipping even further. They traded Linus Ullmark to Ottawa, officially ending the NHL's best goalie tandem. Now it was Swayman's net alone, no backup plan. Jake DeBrusk left in free agency. The center depth behind Lindholm, shaky at best. And the big signings weren't moving the needle. You could feel it. This wasn't a slow decline anymore. This was free fall. And yet the biggest blow was still to come. If there was one guy who embodied Boston hockey, it was Brad Marchand. 16 seasons, a Stanley Cup, the heart of the locker room. He wasn't just a scorer, he was the edge, the attitude, the identity. When Bergeron retired, Marchand took the C without hesitation and wore it with pride. But on March 7th, that all changed. The Bruins traded Brad Marchand to the Florida Panthers. Yeah, Florida, the same team that sent them packing 2 years in a row. Fans were stunned, shocked, some were furious. This wasn't just another player leaving. This was the end of an era. The guy who stuck around when legends walked. The guy who carried the transition. Axed. And with him, any illusion that the Bruins were still contenders. The team framed it as making space for the future. But let's be honest, it was a surrender. After years of trying to thread the needle, retooling, patching holes, staying competitive, Boston finally accepted the truth. They weren't chasing cups anymore. They were tearing it all down. The rebuild had officially begun, and the Marchand trade was the moment everyone felt it. The moment the Bruins didn't just lose a player, they lost who they were. After Marchand was traded, things didn't just get worse, they fell apart. The Bruins, just 2 years removed from the greatest regular season in NHL history, are now one of the worst teams in the Eastern Conference. As of now, they're 4th worst in the entire league. They're closing in on a franchise record losing streak. And it's not just the box score, it's the body language, the lifeless shifts, the empty eyes on the bench. Jeremy Swayman is still fighting in net, but the team in front of him, it's crumbling. Offensively, they're ice cold. Defensively, they've lost structure. And mentally, they just look done. This isn't a rebuild with growing pains. It's a total identity crisis. The Bruins spent years trying to stretch out a window that had already closed. They didn't commit to a full rebuild. They didn't go all in for a cup. They just kept patching and praying, until suddenly there was nothing left to patch. They lost Bergeron, then Krejci, then Ullmark, then Marchand. And now, they've lost everything. The fear they used to inspire in opponents, gone. Now, they're just beatable. Forget feared. They're forgotten. So, what happened? The Bruins tried to stay competitive without rebuilding, clinging to aging stars and safe bets. For a moment, it worked, but the cracks were always there. Now the core is gone, and Boston started from scratch with no clear identity. This season, the only truly competitive player was David Pastrnak, who eclipsed 100 points. Beyond him, there are just the leftovers of former greatness, McAvoy and Swayman. From chasing history to chasing stability, Boston learned the cost of betting on the past. This isn't just a decline, it was a quiet collapse, years in the making.